Hi, Christina here. Just wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about my Cogmed real-time data analysis. Just a little bit about Cogmed. Cogmed was basically birthed out of a research study by Dr. Klingenberg in Europe about 10 years ago. And from there, he was able to gather support from other researchers regarding the possible use of computer adaptive programs to help increase working memory deficits in children. The majority of the research on the website, Cogmed website, does lend itself to ADHD, but there are studies coming out that are regarding other students that could benefit from the program besides ADHD. My slant on this whole thing is whether or not this program would help with the increase in working memory with students that live in poverty. Mostly our students are ELL students, and most of them just live in poverty. And there is research out there that suggests that working memory is not quite developed, and that hinders the students and their academic success down the road, especially early on. If it's not if it's not acquired, and if it's not uh, taught in the earlier grades, parts of the brain that use the working memory that go into your long-term memory. If not taught, the strategies are not taught, the likelihood is that students will not be successful in the future. So Cogmed is a Pearson product, Pearson Publishing Company, and simple background is that last year our psychologist went to a district training on working memory and its deficits, and actually read our book, the book that we read in the fall about working memory. And the goal was to do a book study at our school for the teachers, so the teachers would be aware of working memory, what it is, how it can be utilized, what are some strategies for the classroom. We're not there yet. I'm hoping that I can maybe spearhead that in the future. Long story short, psychologist was supposed to be the one who implements the 30 licenses that were bought by the principal and the psychologist last year, to kind of see if this is a program that would benefit our students overall, and if something that we would continue to purchase um, in the future, if it's definitely a program that would benefit our students. Um, so long story short, because we have an IND units, and we have IND, and we have other units, our psychologist was bogged down with too many student issues this year, so she basically gave me the opportunity to basically implement this program at our school. So with that, I met with one other coach. We were going to pilot the program. It was the ELL resource teacher. So she was one of the trainers, and I was the other trainer. The three protocols that we chose, criteria we chose, was that they were ELL students, because the majority of our kids are ELL. Both the students that we chose were LYC. They both had good attendance, so we knew that they would be able to do their attendance would not be an issue over the course of the program. And lastly, they had to be retained. So I particularly worked with the fourth grade trainee that did not finish the program. The ELL resource teacher worked with a third grade retained student, and she did finish the program. So this real-time analysis is actually of the third grade student and the ELL resource teacher. That's the observation that I chose to do. All right, so getting started here, when we look at the program itself, overall real-time program that I observed, the trainee, which is the student, was able to correctly answer 27% of the questions that were posed for that session, and she incorrectly answered 73% of that. Now, there's a lot of hypotheses that we could talk about: time of day, we could talk about whether the student was tired, we could talk about whether or not the student was using the strategies, whether or not they were giving us the 100%. There's a lot of variables there that would be determined as to why the student didn't do as well as she could have, at least 40%. 40% is something that's kind of like I know that a lot of times our district will use that as a baseline type of thing to see ballpark where they're at as far as where they're doing. I know they were doing that with our fair testing. 40% is the cutoff to see whether or not the students are progressing in a specific category as far as our fair testing is concerned for the state. So I know it's comparing apples to oranges, but nevertheless, that's a good starting point. Um, if we look at some real-time data analysis observation tidbits, you'll see that total session length for this particular observation was 39 minutes. The Cogmed mentions 35 to 45. And if you look at the subsession length, 5 minutes, which to me would be indicative of maybe the correlation as why she only got 27 correct, because as we'll discuss later, rigor plays a big part in these Cogmed subtest games. Another tidbit would be that the coach interacted with the student 44% of the time, and the trainee interacted with the coach 28% of the time, which would be indicative of what should, I think, be happening. Um, I'm wondering, though, if that number, due to the difficulty of this particular session, if that coach's interaction could have been higher, if it's been higher in the past, lower in the past. That would be something for further reflection on that. And if we look at 37% of the session resulted in forced program stops due to multiple consecutive incorrect answers. That's when the program notices that the student is not being successful multiple times in a row. They will forcefully stop, give the student 20 seconds to regroup, have a brain break, stretch, do whatever to kind of refocus their attention so that they can be more successful. And at some point, if they give them the brain break, and most of the time I think they give them two, if at that point they're still not doing well, then they'll just shut them out of that program and move on to a different program. When we look at the program overall, there are 5 subtests that the student does, that interacts with, and each one is very highly interactive. Each one is very student-centered and very much like a program they might do on the internet for fun. So they're highly engaging. The first one is the input module, and I know this one by heart because it's usually the first one that students do, and this is basically a keyboard, and it starts off pretty easy, and it gives them a set of numbers, and they have to put the numbers in backwards. And that's very challenging for a lot of the students, is putting the numbers in backwards. So that's where a lot of strategy use does come into play. But if you'll notice, I think there are 12 questions in this particular subtest, and she only received 25% of them correct. And then the next subtest was the rotating dots. Again, 25% correct of those 12 questions. And the next subtest was the decoder. And the student also trainee only got 25% of those particular questions correct. So it's definitely difficulty on the first 3 subtext sessions. The next one was the 3D cube, and I do recall that one mainly because it was something that most of the kids struggled with, at least my trainee struggled with, and that's where it's like a Rubik's Cube, but it's 3-dimensional, and each little cube lights up, and then the students have to put them in order as they light up, but it's 3-dimensional, so there's multiple sides. It's a lot harder than what you think if you ever get on the website to actually do it yourself. I even got frustrated when I did it. But she did do better on that subtest than she did the first 3. And then lastly, the space whack is kind of like a whack-a-mole in a way. There are different sized meteorites that float in space, and the students have to watch as the game lights them up in consecutive order, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 at a time. And the student has to go back and remember the order in which individual meteorite rocks were being highlighted. That's a little bit more difficult because they're constantly moving. They don't stay in the same position. But once again, she was actually able to answer 50% of the space whack correct. So these were the last 2 subset games were 2 that she, in my opinion, were able to somewhat master more so than the first 3. Maybe because she liked them better. Maybe because she was able to develop a strategy. More observation would have to be noted in order to really dive down and to figure that out at a later time. If you look at the real-time data analysis for the coaching, when I observed the coaching particularly, the coach 20% of the time of session time had affirming comments. 60% of the time was redirection, which says a lot about the 27% correct answers, which once again could be a lot of hypothetical whys as to why 27% of the questions correct. 60%, that's a large amount of time that the coach is having to redirect the student or trainee. And 20% of the time, the coach focused on reminding the student to read the directions. If we look at the behavior of the student, we notice that the student, once again, there's 37% of the time there were forced breaks of the of that time, which would indicate the student needed a break. And, of course, I wasn't able to gather which particular subtest she was having the most difficulty with. I would have hypothesized it was the first three. But moving forward, also, not reading the directions 63% of the time could have resulted in her 27% success rate overall. And then lastly, if we look at the strategy use, she counted on her fingers 40% of the time and 60% of the time. Looking at those two strategies, one has to hypothesize whether or not these two strategies were indicative or actually helpful in her overall scheme of applying these strategies to her success rate of the overall training session of the 5 subsets. I know that the Cogmed is very cognizant of strategies and the use of them. So that's something that I want to dig into next year about maybe general ones that we help the trainees implement, but also maybe personalizing strategies for the kids too, because we want them to take strategies and we want them to transfer into the classroom ultimately. If we look at the real-time analysis interview of the coach's perspective, 5 themes popped up. One was the level of difficulty. Basically, the coach said that herself and the trainee were not, in the beginning, ready for the level of difficulty and rigor that these games required. So that was something that they had to struggle through. The next thing was inability to follow directions, which we saw in what we noticed in the students' real-time analysis. That directly impeded the students' success rate. The third theme was lack of consistent program implementation, and that just comes with all the different interruptions during the day, not absences per se, but just everything that gets in the way of making sure that there's done with fidelity. So the coach actually did mention that lack of consistency in program implementation was definitely a problem in the overall scheme of the program. And then the theme number 4 was she felt this was a positive theme, that the challenge programmed the student. It made the student think. It made her go beyond her comfort zone. And the theme 5 is student accountability and increased effort. She felt that was also a positive theme that allowed the student to take accountability for her work and show more effort in the student when she was able to working with one-on-one. And I'll just go ahead. Basically, I'll leave this here. You can read it if you like. But basically, the 5 themes that I put on the spokes is basically what I wrote here, just for a synopsis of the 5 overall themes that I gleaned from the interview process of the coach. If we look here, we have the conclusion of the overall data, and I'm just going to let you read that. I don't want to read it out loud, so I'll just give you a few times to read that. This is the conclusions that I was able to glean from the data. I thought that maybe the program was too rigorous for the student, that the student was not performing at their ability during this observation. Hard data would have to be analyzed to see whether or not this session was indicative of most sessions or if this was an outlying session. We also indicated that there could be more increase of affirming comments from the coach next time, if this is something that was indicative of all the previous sessions, or if because this was towards the end, if the coach decided not to place as much value on those type of comments during the session. Focus and attention was definitely a problem, and it could have definitely impeded the trainee's overall session success. And even though the student did develop a few strategies, the data suggests that they weren't effective, and that future strategies might be recommended in the future in future training sessions or for future trainees in general. And then the further recommendations are here. Exploration of program criteria for school site may also be something that we could look for future recommendations. Discussion of coach and trainee about the rigor, and talk a little bit more in depth about that. Also talk about the comprehensive coaching behavior and the expectations of the coach. And lastly, program strategy should be something that's implemented and seen as in depth more for next year's 28